Alright, so I have the picture frame out here. I'm not going to go through the whole process of doing everything, because once I show you how this part works, how the joint works, you'll be able to take that and really do any kind of design that you want. A couple things about it, design wise. I left, you can see it looks like this piece of wood passes through here. I like the look of having the vertical piece be continuous and this one be broken. That's the kind of design you would traditionally see in like door construction, whether it's a front door or like cabinetry. Typically, if we were using mortise and tenon joints, this piece here would be continuous, and this piece here would have the tenon that went into the mortise that was in this piece. But it could go either way. I just like the way this looks. What I did with this, size-wise, is I made it to fit in 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And instead of doing a traditional picture frame where you would have a groove going around here called a rabbet or a rebate that would accept a piece of glass and then the picture and then a backing, I just left it flat. And since I was doing it with Colin, it takes some extra work out of it, and thought, well, it'd just be fun to have this. He can take it down when he makes a new drawing and just tape it up here. And I just made a little hole here for a nail, and it hangs right up on the wall like that. So I made it about a 1/2 inch smaller than that. So it's about 8 inches in between here and about 10.5 inches this way. You could size this up for whatever. This type of joinery, I don't do it a lot, but it is pretty strong. I'll show you here in just a second. That's that part of it. So I cut one here quickly in some pine. This is really what the joint looks like. It's called a half lap joint, and all I did was cut a notch or a dado in one piece that goes half the thickness of the board, and an identical one in the other piece that is half the thickness of the board, and they just go together like this. And there you have it. It's a strong joint even without glue, and it's fairly simple to make. If you're not making, 25 of these frames, if you're just making one, in a lot of cases, once you learn how to cut this joint by hand, it's a lot quicker than setting up a table saw or a chop saw and making jigs and measuring 5 times. In this case, actually, we can make this whole project, if we wanted to, without ever touching a tape measure. And I'll show you what I mean by that. We can actually be way more accurate working with these tools by completely ignoring tape measures, and I'll show you those methods. So I'll take this apart here and set this aside and show you real briefly the tools that we're going to use. What you need for this is some kind of a square. I have a combination square here. This is my one of my most valuable tools. Having a good solid square is super, super critical when you're making complicated stuff. For this kind of a project, if you have a speed square, like a roofing square, something like that, cheap combination square, that's going to work just fine. A knife, super important. This one isn't anything special. They make really expensive woodworking knives. This is a kind of a standard Stanley knife that you can get. I just sharpen the tip a little bit differently to make it work really well for what I need. But I've done this with a pocket knife. I've done it with a utility knife, an X-Acto knife. Anything would work. A chisel. Most people have something laying around. This is my kind of nicer set of chisels here, but I have some old beaters that I throw in my tool bag. If you have something like this lying around, don't be fooled. This thing can be sharpened just as sharp as this, sharp enough to shave hairs right off your arm. And I'll show you. This one's pretty dull, so I'll show you how to touch that up if you have these laying around. So those are just a few of them. I'm going to use, since I have some nicer saws, this is my dovetail saw. Most people probably don't have one of these laying around if you don't do this already. So I tried this, and this project, with a simple, cheap $5 Stanley hacksaw, you can cut some nice fine joinery using this. So I'll show you that it works just as fine with this too. In the spirit of not measuring things, I'm going to be using this bit too. This is called a marking gauge, and what this does is it has a movable fence on it, and there's a pin on this side that when I set this to a width and then I run this along the board, it's going to give me a really, really definitive line, as opposed to you know, the lead of a pencil that's quite a bit thicker, where there's guesswork in guessing where the line actually is. The line that comes from this and from a knife are extremely definitive, and I'll show you how that goes. But it's unlikely that, again, that you'd have one of these. So I have a little improvised tool here that is really the same thing. This is just a screw with a flat head on it that I sort of filed just to make it sharp, but you really wouldn't need to. And instead of like on here where I can move this and then tighten it, you just drive a screw into a block of wood and turn the screw to adjust the depth. And it works just the same. I can place this flat against here, run a line just like that, and I get a perfectly straight line, just the same. If I run another line with this, same thing. I get a nice definitive line. So again, you know, these are tools that maybe you're not likely to have. These are perfect substitutes. They do the exact same job. So I'm going to, just for a second though, I'm going to take away the extras to keep this a little bit tidy. I have a pretty small workbench in my garage. I try to not take up too big of a footprint. So we'll bring those back later when we need them. So I'm going to show you kind of the concepts to keep in mind when you're laying out this picture frame here. So the measurements that is important is the finish size on the inside of here. So when you have your material, let's pretend these are going to be your two long sides, and maybe these are going to be our two short sides. You can use a tape measure and measure out what you need, or you can literally take a piece of 8.5 by 11 piece of paper to do your sizing. But I'm going to start with the knife on my two long sides, and I'm going to mark what will be the, let me just check here, I'll adjust you a little bit. This is not very high production value, so too bad. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the distance, the inside distance between here on these boards. And for you know, our purposes here, I could just put my knife right in here and take the measurement. But let's say you don't have that, so you have your piece of paper and you lay it on here and you want just a little bit of overlap. Basically figure out where your mark is going to be. And we're going to start with just a knife nick. Let's just imagine it's going to be right here, and we're going to make a little knife mark right there. You can't see it on the camera very well, but if I slide my knife along here, like you can feel when it drops right in, and that's absolutely definitive. So what I've just marked is going to be the location of the inside of this board. And we'll get to where the other side of this notch or this dado is going to be by taking it directly off of here in a minute. So to get the other side, again, you could measure this, that's fine, or you could just take it right from the piece of paper, just put it where it needs to be. I'm not going to do that because I'm just going to show you how to make one corner. But the same would apply for then our short sides. We take a measurement here, and whatever our width we want to be, we're going to use knife marks. But really, one of the cool things about this, it makes things so accurate, is I have my knife mark right here, Okay, and imagine these are the two long sides of my picture frame. Now, instead of measuring this and then trying to measure this, you remember when I said we're going to avoid measuring at all costs. Instead, we're going to gang these up together. And just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to pretend that I marked this other side. I'm just going to put an arbitrary knife mark here. So I'm going to gang these up together. And now, again, instead of measuring, I'm going to flush up the ends here so I know they're even. And I'm going to make sure they don't move now. I'm going to put my square on here. Now I'm going to find my knife mark, and I'm going to put my knife right into it like that. And now carefully slide the square up, right up to the knife. And now I'm just going to gently draw a small knife mark right here onto the second piece. Now I know that those two marks are going to match up exactly where they need to. I'm going to come down here, and without moving them, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to find my knife mark, slide up to it, draw a nice little knife line right across there. And now I know for sure that those are going to be perfectly lined up. You can kind of see where this is going. If I had done that here, now my two knife marks are, I'll do it this way just so you can see. We know that that's going to be a perfect 90 degrees. It's going to line up perfectly, and it's going to be the same thing up here. So let's start here. So now that we have the location, we need to mark out both sides of the joint of the dado. Make sure you can still see. So what I'm going to do is find my mark again here. I'm going to draw a line across like this, and I'm going to pull lightly at first, because when you're first breaking the surface fibers, if you push too hard, your fingers can slip on the square. You don't end up with a good straight line. So really lightly at first, there's barely anything. And then you can just apply a little bit more pressure each time until you have a nice definitive mark that if I drag my tip across the board, you can hear that click, drop right into it. I'm never going to lose where that is. I'm going to mark with a pencil here, just where these parts are going to go. I'm going to put an X here, and I'm going to put an X here. So now, here's the fun part. Instead of measuring this and trying to look, I just ripped this board down in two here a second ago and planed it, and I'm sure they're not even. So let's see if I can get that on camera. What is that? That is like somewhere under or more than 5/8, somewhere in the middle. My point is, see how that was to interpret? Instead of trying to measure the space here, I'm going to take, doesn't matter what the numbers are, this just has to fit in here. So I need to make a hole here that's this big. To do that, I'm going to get my square in place with this. I'm going to put my knife in here, slide the square up to it, hold this really securely. Now, I'm going to put this piece, this is the piece that's going to go inside of here. I'm going to put it here and hold it there. And now, I'm going to take the knife, make sure you guys can see this on camera. Double check now that I moved it. Hold this here, and now I'm going to go right into the corner. Right into the corner and make a knife mark. You're better off almost like you're trying to slip under this piece just a little bit and making the dado too small, because you can always shave some wood off of here, but if you cut it too wide, it's always going to be too sloppy. So make that knife mark. Now I'm going to go back, find my knife mark here, slide the square up, draw my line straight across like that. Now I know exactly how wide this needs to be to cut that notch, that dado. Next thing, with the marking gauge, since these two pieces are even, I need to take half the thickness off of this one and half the thickness off of this one so that when I put them together, they're flush. So with my marking gauge, I need to find the center of this board. And the easiest way to do that is not to measure, but to guess visually. I'm going to look right here. I'm going to think, it looks close to center. Measure from this side, flip it over and measure from this side. And if that hole lines up, which it just, I don't know if you can see, I'm off by like a 64th of an inch. It's just the slightest tap. Try it again. Now it lines up perfectly, so I'll tighten this up, keep my setting where it needs to be. When I run this gauge line, I need to make this gauge, the gauge line we're marking again is the depth of how far down we're going to cut here. I need to know where to stop, because I'm going to be running a line like in here. So I'll usually just put a little pencil mark here. Doesn't have to be too accurate, just to know where I need to run that line. Otherwise you end up with, in your finished piece, you know, this ugly line way down here. It doesn't need to be there. So now that I know where that is, I will just run my line, and maybe I'll do it this way so you can see. You can use this pulling. You'll hold this square up against here, run a line like that, and now this, just like a knife line, when I go to get down to depth, I know that I can go right into here with my chisel, and that will be exactly the final depth it needs to be. We have to work on this from both sides. You'll see that in a minute. So I put the line here on this side, so I also need to put it on this side. I'm just going to eyeball it, since this is, I'm not going to worry about overshooting my line here. Okay. So honestly, me talking so far has taken way more time than it takes to actually do this. So I'm going to get on with cutting this joint a little bit. But before I do, a couple of things. Part of the reason that we put these knife lines in here is to get a really accurate placement, but also it helps us with getting a really clean cut on the surface, because we're cross-cutting. When we cut across here, we'll get fiber tear out from the grain of the wood. So I'm going to show you how to chisel down into this line to get a really, really clean cut. To do that, I'll do it facing you. I'm going to start, let's double check here. Bring you in. I just need to remember to bring you guys back out. I'm going to start just away from this line a little bit and really, really gently chisel up to the line. And then I can just get those little pieces out of the way. If there's some pieces left over, it really doesn't matter. You can take a knife and get the rest of those out of there. I'm going to do the other side here real quick, as long as I've got it in the vise. So now, when I go to make this cut, oh, we're zoomed in way too far. I'll take a guess. Now when I go to do this cut, I have a really definitive step down here, so that I can put my saw, use this side, my saw will fit right up against that, and there's no room for error whatsoever. I mean, it takes all the guesswork out. If I slide my saw along to this side, just drag it across, and I can feel definitively when that saw gets in that step down. So now, I just need to saw from here down to this line. I'm going to try to stop just shy of it. Let's see how that goes. Now, I should mention this too. This is probably the most important tool in the shop, is my vise. However, if you don't have a vise or a workbench, this is all still possible, just with simple little clamps like this. In fact, you know what? I'll do it this way just to show you. Oh, and that reminds me too, I said I would do one with a hacksaw. So I'll grab that too. So we're nice and secure in the vise. My makeshift vise. And I'm going to get right up next to this knife line, right into it. And I'm going to concentrate on sawing straight down. A tip, if you do have a saw for sawing at 90 degrees, you can draw a line at 90 degrees, but what I do is I can see the reflection in the saw. I don't know if you can see this on camera, but you can see the wood reflecting in the saw plate, and when I can see that the reflection passes straight, I know that I'm at 90 degrees. If I go like this, the reflection starts to angle up and away and doesn't look continuous, then I know I'm out of square. So it's little tricks like that that you learn that make things, by teaching yourself the body mechanics and muscle memory, just like anything else, that make this stuff fast. Now I say that and I just sawed out a square. That's all fixable. Everything's fixable. So you can see I sawed down here right just above my line. Now I'll put this in the vise, and I'll do this one with a hacksaw just because I never have, but I'm pretty sure you can. Let's see why not. Start here. Ooh, a little closer to the vise. You hear how that was getting loud? Further away you are from the vise, more vibration, there's more noise, and the kids are asleep right up there. So it's a little aggressive bimetal cobalt blade. It's a little aggressive for the soft pine. It's actually sticking out. It is working just fine. I'm quite certain, given a little bit of practice with this saw, I'd be able to do this just fine. So would you. Okay, so now the fun part. We've sawed down, let's see, okay, yeah, we've sawed down here and here, and we have our line here, so we know that this needs to come out, all sides. So, do this. I wonder if you can see a little better this way. So I'm gonna try to work out of the side of the vise a little bit, hoping that you can see that better. All right, so all we're gonna do is get rid of this waste now, and a few different ways we can do this, but this is pine. It should split away pretty easily. I'm gonna start with a really shallow bite, and because we never know exactly what's inside the wood until we cut it, we always want to aim for the sky just a little bit so that we don't split too deeply and end up breaking the piece that we're working on. Working across the grain like this, though, takes a lot of the risk away. If you were to put this chisel in the end like this, you could end up splitting the whole thing. That's just how wood grain works. But using pear cutting like this, when we're cutting it across the grain, that's called pear cutting. It takes a lot of risk away. Even though it seems like it's, using a little bit of force, it's actually, once we get some more of this out of here, this is a really sensitive work, and it doesn't take a lot of strength, especially in this pine. Working with pine is a little bit frustrating sometimes. I think it would be easier because it's softer, but because it's softer, it tends to punish dull tools. It doesn't tolerate being worked with dull tools nearly as well as a hardwood like oak or maple would to get clean cuts, because when we're putting an edge into here, this is soft and it tends to crush rather than shear cleanly. So being sharp actually is way more critical. Well, it's always critical, get me wrong, but it's way more critical in pine than it is in hardwoods if you want a clean surface. Nice thing about this is the chisel work is going to be hidden inside of a glued joint. It's we want to aim for perfection, but not going to get held up because this surface isn't the prettiest thing in the world. Although with a sharp chisel, I can make this, pretty smooth if I want. so I should shut up and stop talking. But I slowly worked down to my line, and once I got here, I left just a little bit on the corner here. I'm registering my chisel right inside there and using that to make the final depth adjustment. So in that little corner now, go into where that line was, and I'm gently pear cutting straight across, just feeling for this being at level at 90 degrees to the piece. And that's good for now. You'll notice I didn't go all the way through. Again, working across the grain, if I were to push the chisel all the way through this piece, I would blow out the fibers that are outside of where my cut is, and I would blow out this section here. So I need to cut this way where the fibers are supported on the back side. So it's a little harder, far side of the camera here, so I'll make quick work of it and get on to the next part of this. Soft wood like this, you don't really need a chisel hammer or mallet, but if you were working in harder wood and it's not working for you, a rubber mallet or a chisel hammer like this, just gently going across like that will do you just fine. So now I've gone down to my depth mark on this side as well. And now I'm just going to eyeball it for it to be flat. There's a number of other things we could do here to make sure it was a perfectly flat and level joint. I'm not all that worried because it's pine, it compresses well when we clamp it, and it's good practice to do it without any sort of aids. So I'm going to go into my line here and feel for level and just run the chisel using the back of the chisel as a guide. And any high spots I'm going to pick up because I've come down to my line accurately. So that's good. And then I'll just take the back of the chisel and sight across here. I don't know how to show you guys, but I can use this. See, I can feel I have a high spot right in the middle. And then I can just use that to go back and tune. And that'll do just fine. If this were something more precise, I have a tool here called a router plane, and this is what we had before what we all know as powered routers. I have a bigger base on here, so it has a little more reach. But this iron sticks through the bottom, and this is perfectly flat. So I can run this across here, and I can make sure that I get an absolutely flat surface and that this is perfectly parallel to this. It is a genius tool. Dead simple in how it works. Completely genius tool. It's really useful. I use this for this kind of stuff all the time if it has to be really precise. Just barely taking a shaving there. Now I know we're all level. So that's a fun tool. It's not one that most people are likely to have around if they weren't already into this sort of stuff. But the whole point of this was that you can do this with tools you probably already have. So I'm going to shut up about it now. Okay, so I had some loose fibers here. I was just taking the knife in the corner and cutting those because we want this to be nice crisp corners with nothing interfering, seating the joint once we put it together. All right, once again, I'm going to get rid of some extra tools. Proved that the hacksaw worked, so that's just fine. Although I forgot about the chisel, so I will show you real quickly how to sharpen this, again, with stuff you probably have, just in case you have a chisel but it's dull. I'll show you how to sharpen it. I should have laid this out before I cut this, my mistake, but I did put a knife line here already. Remember when I transferred that across? We'll just use it. Okay, so because I just ripped this board down, whichever way it was, like that, and planed it, I might not have gotten everything perfect. So I can't just, again, I can't take the same measurement. I need to take exactly this width. So again, make sure you can see what I'm doing here. Again, I'm going to put the knife in the line, slide the square up to it, put this piece on here, get right tight in the corner, mark it, pull the line across, like that. Take my, I'm just going to double check these should be the same. Yep. Pull my gauge line. Pull my gauge line here. That's good. We'll do some sawing. Let's get over here. So I'll shut up a little bit more this time, and maybe now you can see how quick this actually is. Okay, make this one go fast. The lighting is a little bit terrible in here, so it's good on top of the bench, but not back here where I need to see this line. I guess that's old age. Just turned 35 yesterday. Flip it around, come from the other side. Whoops. Really, this, oh, no, I screwed up. Lost my line. Really, this joint, it uses the same techniques. I guess people don't really refer to it as a dado joint, but it really is the same thing. And really the same joint. We could build cabinets using almost only dado joints. You could build, what's my line? Let's get it carried away. A bookcase is built almost, or can be built anyways, almost exclusively with dado joints, using nothing but a saw and a chisel, really. So it's a worthwhile joint to work on. The only difference between this really and a standard dado joint is that instead of on a dado removing something from both, we might have this groove and a piece fits into it like this rather than having two notches. So, moment of truth, this is probably going to be too tight, if I had to guess, because I usually do that since I don't do this for a living, and I don't do it enough to just always get it perfect right off the bat. I always try to make things too tight, and then it's easy to adjust them after that. But I think this one, good way to check. So we're fitting really a lot of different surfaces at once. If I flip this over, I can see that this one is going to go in. So this opening is going to fit this. Now I need to check the other way. And I think that this one is going to be just a little bit too tight. So, options. I don't know if you can see, it's really not much. And I probably could force it together, but my options here are to make this bigger, which can be done, but it's a little more difficult, or make this smaller. Now, for me, every time, I'm going to do this space and I'm going to make it smaller. You probably don't have a hand plane sitting around at your house, but you could easily just sand down a little bit here. I'm going to take just a couple of shavings here and see if that improves our fit. Okay, it's just started now. I'm going to take a couple more out on the other side. That should, I hope, put us in the ballpark. Maybe just a little more. Let's try it. I might have planed things out of square just a little bit. So it's going together, and rather than beat on it, kids are sleeping upstairs, you just squeeze it together in the vise. So it goes together. Hopefully you can see on camera. I'm standing behind it so I can see. So far now, it's not quite flush across here. And it's not quite flush across here. And if I look on the back, this one here is a little proud of this. So I would not let that worry me, because so far I haven't really fine-tuned any of this. I usually try to get it close. But it's better to not go too deep on this stuff until you can test fit it. Because you never know, you could have measured wrong. Maybe this piece was too thick, or this one was thinner or something. And then once you go past a certain point, you can't remove material to make it fit. You've gone too far. So my next step then would be to go back and look at these carefully. Make sure I got them down to my gauge lines, make sure they're flat, which was the second one here. I think this one. I know that I left some humps in here that I didn't go after yet. But that is how the corner goes together. The way that this is cut, I would have this one as the vertical piece in the picture frame, or I guess it could have been that way. That is literally all the joinery for the frame. You do that 3 times. It's that simple. For shaping, I think I just saw this somewhere and stole it. I left these square and I cut these at a little bit of an angle, just because, just because I like the look of it. You could certainly cut these ones at an angle too, but I kind of like the look. You're free to do whatever you want. When you're sanding this thing, I typically don't sand because off the plane I can get a way nicer surface without having to sand. But when you sand, be careful that you don't, see I have small gaps here, and part of that, the corners of this lumber got rounded. And on these meeting surfaces, this needs to be nice and crisp, and so does this. It doesn't matter, you want it to not have gaps, but it's not always perfect. And this was a fast project with a 5-year-old, so, take what you get. So that's that. Oh, I'm sorry. I said that I would show you real quickly how to sharpen a chisel too, because a lot of people do have these around at home, and they're not always sharp, and they do need to be. So I looked. I don't have any sandpaper around here right now, but the technique is exactly the same. You can do this just fine on sandpaper. I have a set of 3 diamond stones here that make life really, really easy. But if you have some like 200, 300, 400 grit sandpaper, you can do this. If you have a chisel that's really, really beat up, I'm sure I have one here that I haven't restored yet. No, I don't. If you have a chisel that's really beat up, I will start with 60 grit sandpaper until I work out all the dings and nicks in the edge, and then move up. 400 grit sandpaper is as polished as this ever needs to be. Some people will tell you need to have a 20,000 grit stone. That's ridiculous. As soon as you stick it into a piece of wood, that edge is shot. So this is simple. Find the angle of the bevel on top. Just rock around till you find it. It should be about 30 degrees. If you have an old chisel that somebody's ruined on a grinder and all messed it up, just know about 30 degrees. And even this, it's not that critical. This is 90. If this is 0 and this is 90 and this is 45, 30's about there. It's not that critical. It makes a difference in how the chisel performs, but it doesn't matter for this project. So I'm going to find the bevel right about here. This feels a little steep, and I'm just going to try to apply even pressure and go back and forth on the stone. Try to keep all this even so that I'm not rocking the chisel. I'm going to go back and forth on the stone until I start to feel a burr form on the back side here. That means I'm down to a fresh edge. And this one was pretty dinged up. Diamond stones cut really fast, so I have a burr there. Not going to be able to see it on camera, but at that point I'll move on to my slightly finer stone. Finish up on my other stone here. This is like 300, 600, 1200, I think. And then the most important thing, really, again, if you don't have this, it really doesn't matter for this project. But leather strap here with just strapping honing compound on it. I'm gonna just pull across here a bunch of times, and a few on the back to take that burr off. I don't know if you can see it on camera or not, but focus. Come on. Well, it's a tiny little burr that's coming off. You can see a corner of it right here. All the strapping is doing is taking the burr off and kind of polishing the edge. You could do it on a piece of wood, or again, this kind of stuff isn't. What the chisel work you're doing is hidden inside of a joint, so it really doesn't matter. But this is sharp enough now. Remember how I said it would crush pine when you cut it? This is sharp enough. It's doing a pretty good job. It's I could have polished more and it would be better, but I'm getting a pretty nice surface and end grain there with this chisel now. Sharpening isn't difficult. It just takes a little practice, muscle memory. I think I took that chisel to sharpness in like a minute, so that's how it's done.